You are standing at the edge of a driveway in Black Ridge, Montana, at 5:40 in the morning, and the temperature reads 11 degrees below zero, and somewhere ahead of you, past the tree line, a girl is pulling a sled through snow that comes up past her knees. She is 11 years old. She has been doing this every morning for 6 days. The rope in her hands is yellow nylon, frayed at the loop where her fist has worn it thin, and behind her the sled carries split firewood stacked higher than her waist, and behind that, 2 miles back through timber and drifted road, is a cabin with a dead furnace, and a 5-year-old boy whose fever has not broken since Tuesday. This is not a story about a storm. Stay until the end and you will understand why 300 men on motorcycles rode into a town that had forgotten this family existed and what it cost one of them to be the man who stopped. If you have ever driven past someone who needed help and told yourself it wasn't your problem, comment your city. Someone needs to hear that it still can be. 6 days earlier, the furnace in that cabin gave one long shudder and went quiet, the pilot light gone out sometime in the black hours before dawn, and no one heard it happen because there was no one else in the house old enough to notice until the cold had already settled into the walls. The girl found it dead when she woke. She did not cry. She had stopped crying somewhere, in the 3 months since her father did not come home from the logging site on the ridge, since the sheriff's truck idled in the driveway for 11 minutes and then left, since a neighbor woman with kind eyes and no authority called the county welfare office and was told someone would come by the end of the week. No one came by the end of the week. The girl learned, in the space of those 3 months, what dry wood costs, what wet wood does to a chimney, and how far the nearest standing timber was from a woman who owed her dead husband's estate nothing and had let her woodpile go to whoever needed it. 2 miles. She learned the distance the way other children learn multiplication tables, by necessity, by repetition, by the particular ache that settles into a shoulder that has pulled the same rope 40 mornings running. She left before first light because the cold was worse then and the boy's fever climbed worse then too, and because if she waited for daylight, the wind came down off the ridge and turned the road into a wall of white that swallowed the fence line, the mailbox, the shape of the world itself. She did not know, on the 6th morning, that the wind would take the road from her before she made it home. She only knew the rope in her hand, and the weight behind her, and the boy waiting. The cabin held 2 rooms and a loft, and the loft was where the boy slept because heat rose, or was supposed to, before the furnace gave out somewhere in the black hours of a night in early December, and never spoke again. She had gone down with a flashlight and found the pilot light dead, and the housing cold to the touch, cold as the doorknob, cold as the window glass, and she had understood without anyone telling her that this was a thing beyond her hands. She was 11. She knew how to feed a fire. She did not know how to raise the dead. So she fed the fire instead, the wood stove in the front room, squat and iron and older than her father had been, the only heat left in the house. And she learned to keep her brother's cot pulled close enough that she could hear the change in his breathing, the small catch that meant the fever had climbed again, without needing to touch his forehead to know it. On the 6th morning she woke before the clock on the wall would have told her to, if the clock had still worked, which it had not since November. She woke the way she had taught herself to wake, the body doing it without asking the mind. The stove had burned down to orange coals. The boy's breathing had the catch in it. She dressed in the dark, 2 shirts, her father's old coat with the sleeves folded back, socks doubled inside boots a size too big, and she did not turn on the flashlight until she was outside, because batteries were another thing that cost money nobody had. The wind had already started its work on the yard, scouring the porch steps clean, piling low drifts against the fence posts in shapes that changed by the hour. She checked on the boy once more before she left. A habit, not a decision, the way a person checks a lock they know is already locked, and told him she would be back before he woke all the way, which was mostly true, and had been true 5 mornings running. She took the sled from where it leaned against the woodpile that no longer held wood, and the rope went into her palm the way it always did now, worn into a groove her hand had made itself, yellow nylon gone gray with handling. 2 miles out to the dead woman's stand of timber, 2 miles back with whatever she could split and load and still pull. The sky, when she started, was the color of a held breath. Somewhere north of the ridge, though she had no way to know it, a line of trucks and a string of motorcycles trailered against the weather were already moving south on schedule, carrying diesel heaters and dry goods and canned meat toward cabins the county map still listed, and the county itself had stopped visiting. She did not know they existed. She only knew the rope, the 2 miles, and the specific gray light that meant she had perhaps 40 minutes before the wind came down off the ridge the way it always did, and turned the road into something no one could see through. The dead woman's timber stand stood where the land flattened before it climbed again, 6 spruce and a fallen fir that had been down long enough to season, and she had learned in the last 5 days which limbs would split clean and which would fight the axe like something alive. She was not permitted to think of it as stealing. The woman had died in October, alone, and no one had come for the wood either, and the girl had decided somewhere in the second morning that the dead did not need heat and the living did, and that this was not a thing she needed anyone's permission to believe. She worked the axe her father had kept oiled, and now she kept oiled, wiping the head with a rag soaked in what was left of a can of neatsfoot, because a father who split wood for 11 years had taught her that a tool left wet and cold would rust by spring, and she intended, without saying so to herself in words, to still be doing this in spring. The axe came down and the wood came apart, and she counted the pieces the way she had been taught to count anything that mattered, not aloud, just a pressure behind the teeth. 11 splits. 12. She stopped at 16 because the sled had a weight past which the rope cut into her palm in a way that meant she would not make the 2 miles back, and she had learned that lesson on the second day, dragging too much, arriving with her hands bleeding into her mittens and her brother's fever no lower for the extra logs she'd burned faster than she should have trying to warm a cabin whose walls no longer held anything in. She loaded the sled and looked once at the sky, which had gone from held breath to something with teeth in it, gray sliding toward the flat white that meant the wind was closer than 40 minutes now. She had misjudged. She started back anyway because there was no other direction to go, and the rope found its groove in her palm, and she leaned into it the way a much older person leans into a life they did not choose but will not set down. A mile behind her, if she had turned to look, she would have seen nothing yet. No trucks, no bikes, no line of men who did not know her name and were riding south on a schedule that had nothing to do with her, toward cabins that were numbers on a list, hers among them, unremarkable, 3 months overdue for a welfare check no one had made. She did not turn to look. She kept her eyes on the 2 ruts the sled had cut into the snow over 5 mornings, ruts that were already filling in behind her, the wind erasing the road home before she had finished walking it. The wind found her before the cold did, the way it always found the highest ground first, and then came down looking for whatever else it could take. 11 years earlier, and 340 miles away, he had been sitting on a stool in a bar in Butte, with a beer going flat in front of him, when his phone rang, and he had known before he answered it, the way a man knows the weather has turned before the first drop hits his skin, some pressure change in the blood. He had ridden through the night to get there. He had made good time. He had made excellent time, actually, a fact he had turned over so many times since that it had gone smooth as a stone in a creek, no edges left to catch on. Good time was not the same as enough time. He had learned that at the bottom of a driveway, with the house still smoking, and the fire department's hoses lying slack in the snow like dead things, everyone finished. Everyone already moved on to the part where they wrote reports. He did not think about this every day anymore. That was the lie he told himself that had become, through repetition, something closer to true. He thought about it in weather like this. Genuine cold. Cold with intention. Because cold was the last thing his daughter had ever felt. That wasn't fire. The fireman had told him that much. Smoke before flame. And he had built a whole theology around that detail. Had decided it meant she went easier than she might have. He did not know if this was true. He had never asked anyone whose job it was to know. The girl did not know any of this. She knew only the 2 ruts filling in behind her and the specific weight of the rope, which had changed in the last mile, gone from ache to something duller, something that had stopped reporting to her, the way a hand stops reporting when it's been cold too long. She had felt this before, on the 4th morning, and had learned that if she flexed her fingers inside her brother's outgrown gloves every 100 steps, feeling came back sharp and unwelcome, which she had decided was better than the alternative, though she could not have said why, only that a body that stops complaining is a body that has stopped fighting for itself, and she was not ready to let go of that fight, even in the smallest finger. The white came down around her in earnest now, erasing the tree line first, then the fence posts, then the shape of the hill itself, until she was walking inside a single gray thought, with no edges, the rope in her hand the only fact left standing, and somewhere south of her, engines she could not hear were already turning over in cold garages, warming toward a road that did not yet know it needed them. The garage smelled of diesel and cold rubber, the particular smell of engines that had sat dormant since November, and he moved through it in the dark with the economy of a man who had dressed in the dark for 30 years, boots first, then the jacket with the patches gone soft and gray at the seams, then the gloves he did not put on until the last possible moment, because his hands worked better bare for as long as the cold would allow it. Outside, the sky over the ridge had the flat white look that old-timers called a warning sky, though no one could say exactly what it warned of until it had already happened. He checked the chain on the trailer twice. He always checked twice. Habits from another life had migrated into this one without asking permission, the way a body remembers how to duck before the mind remembers why. 11 years earlier, in a different cold, he had been 340 miles away on a run when his phone rang at 2:14 in the morning, and he had known before he answered it, the way men who have spent time in places where phones only ring for bad news come to know these things in their spine before their ears. He did not let himself walk that hallway again this morning. He had trained himself, over 11 Decembers, to feel the door of that memory swing open and to shut it before the smoke came, before the small shoes by the back porch came, before the sound their mother made came. He shut it now. He checked the chain a third time. The younger rider was already outside, breath fogging above the handlebars, watching him, with the particular patience of someone who had learned not to ask questions before coffee. Between them there was the kind of silence that had become its own language over 2 winters of runs, a silence that said the older man's face was doing something this morning it did not usually do, and that the younger man had decided, wisely, to let it. They pulled onto the county road as the first real snow began, fine and dry and moving sideways, the kind that did not fall so much as travel, hunting for edges to pile against. Somewhere north of them, though neither man could have said how he knew it, something had gone quiet in a way that was different from the ordinary quiet of a snowbound morning. Not the quiet of people sleeping in, but the quiet of a body that had stopped fighting the cold and started, very slowly, to agree with it. The older man's hands, bare on the grips a moment longer than the cold should have allowed, tightened once, for no reason he could have named, and he opened the throttle a fraction more than the road conditions called for, riding north into the white, the way a man rides towards something he has not yet been told he is looking for. 6 days before, though neither man riding north could yet count it that way, the furnace in the cabin had made a sound like a held breath finally let go, a single mechanical sigh, the pilot light guttering blue, and then not at all, and the girl had stood over it in her father's flannel shirt, the sleeves rolled 4 times, waiting for the tick of the igniter that did not come. She had not cried. She had learned in 3 months that crying used something the cold would later ask her for, and she had grown careful with her resources, the way her father had once been careful with his ammunition, his fuel, his last good boots. She had gone to the wood stove instead, the small iron one meant for supplementing, never for carrying a whole house through a Montana December, and she had built a fire in it with the last of the split kindling, and told her brother, 5 years old, and burning with a fever, she did not have a thermometer to measure, that the big furnace was only resting. He had believed her. That was the first thing she noticed about grief. In the weeks after their father did not come home from the logging road, how willing the boy was to believe her, how completely he had transferred his faith from a man who no longer answered to a sister who had never asked to be answered to. She had found this both a comfort and a weight, the two feelings arriving together and refusing to separate, the way cold and pain arrive together on skin left too long in wind. The neighbor's woodpile sat 2 miles east, behind a house that had been empty since October. The old man who owned it moved to his daughter's place in Missoula, or dead, or simply gone the way people went from Black Ridge without announcement. The girl did not know which and had decided it did not matter. What mattered was the cordwood, split and stacked and covered with a blue tarp gone brittle at the edges. Wood that no one was using, and her brother needed to survive the nights. She had taken the sled from the shed on the second morning, its plastic runners scarred from some earlier child's earlier winter, and she had tied the yellow rope to it herself, testing the knot twice the way her father had taught her to test knots, pulling until her knuckles whitened, before she trusted it with anything that mattered. She had made the walk 4 times since, each morning a little earlier than the last, though she could not have said why, only that something in her had begun keeping its own clock, independent of the sun, tuned instead to the sound of her brother's breathing changing in the dark, thinner each night, a sound like paper being folded, and to a fear she did not have a word for yet, riding toward her now from the south on 2 wheels she did not know existed. 11 years before that morning, 340 miles south, a different fire had its own clock, and it did not wait for anyone to be ready. He had been at a roadside diner outside Casper when the call came through, the phone buzzing against a table, already sticky with syrup, and the voice on the other end had said, "House fire," the way people say words they have not yet let themselves understand. He remembered standing. He remembered a stool tipping behind him and not hearing it hit the floor. He remembered nothing else about the diner, not its name, not its smell, only the black coffee going cold in a cup he never touched again, and the 340 miles that unspooled after that, like a rope with no knot in it. Nothing to test, nothing to trust, just distance doing what distance does, which is arrive too late. He had ridden through the night without stopping to eat, without stopping for anything, and he had told himself the whole way that he would make it, the way a man tells himself a lie he needs to survive the telling of it. He had not made it. By the time his bike hit the gravel of that driveway, there was nothing left of the house but a shape the fire had drawn in the snow, black against white, and a fire chief who would not meet his eyes, and a small quiet in the world where his daughter's voice used to be. He did not carve. He was not a man who worked with his hands in that way. But she had been, small as she was, 7 years old and already patient with wood, in a way he had never been patient with anything, and the horse in his saddlebag was the last thing she made, unfinished at the mane, one flank still rough where her knife had not gone deep enough to smooth it. He had kept it 11 years without looking at it more than he had to. He had built a wall around that particular grief the way a man builds a levee, not to stop the water but to survive standing next to it. Now, riding north on a road going white at the edges, he did not know that a girl 2 miles ahead of him was pulling a sled with a rope she had tested twice, the way her father taught her, before trusting it with her brother's life. He did not know her brother's breathing had gone thin as paper in the dark. He knew only the wind changing character against his face, sharper now, carrying something that was not quite snow yet but intended to be, and beside him the younger rider they called Tick, goggles fogging at the edges, shouting something about the front moving faster than forecast. He did not answer. He had learned, over 11 years, that some weather you simply rode into, and you found out on the other side of it what it had cost you. The road unspooled beneath them the color of bone. He had ridden through weather like this before, in another life, on a different kind of errand, and the body remembered, even when the mind refused to. His hands knew the cold before his face did. That was the Marine in him, or maybe just the years, some part of a man that keeps its own counsel about what it has survived and simply prepares, wordlessly, for the next survival. 6 days earlier, in the cabin now growing smaller behind the front, a girl had knelt by a furnace that would not answer her. She had turned the dial the way she had watched her father do it, twice, 3 times, the way you check a knot that has to hold. Nothing. The pilot light gone the way small mercies go, without ceremony, without warning, taking with it the one certainty a house needs in December. She had not cried. She had gone instead to the window and looked at the tree line, gray and close, and understood in the plain way children understand disasters, that the cold was no longer outside the walls. It was inside now. It had gotten in. He did not know this. He knew the front was moving faster than the radio had promised. Knew Tick's voice had the particular strain of a younger man discovering that weather does not negotiate. He throttled down, not from fear, but from the old training that treated fear as information rather than command. Ahead, the road curved along the ridge the town was named for, and somewhere past that curve, past a stand of lodgepole pine stripped bare by a beetle kill nobody had bothered to clear, a girl's rope was already 3 days into its testing. Knots retied each morning with fingers that had learned, faster than any fingers should have to, which grips held and which failed. He thought, unbidden, of his daughter's hands. Small ones, always finding rope or ribbon or the frayed edge of something to tie and untie, an idle habit he'd never asked about because he'd assumed there would be time to. There is a particular arithmetic to grief, where a man calculates, again and again, all the questions he did not think were urgent. He had stopped doing that math out loud years ago. It still ran in the background, the way an engine idles even parked. The snow began in earnest just past the county line, not falling so much as arriving, sideways, thickening the air until the tree line vanished, and the road narrowed to whatever his headlamp could hold. Tick pulled closer, a shape more than a rider now. Somewhere in that whiteness, a mile and then less than a mile ahead, a sled with a fraying yellow rope sat abandoned at an angle in a drift, and its rope's end disappeared into snow that had already begun, patiently, to cover what it held. The headlamp caught it first, a comma of yellow against white, punctuation in a sentence the storm was trying to erase. He was off the bike before it had fully stopped, boots sinking to the shin, the cold finding the gap between glove and cuff with the specificity of something that had been waiting all day to do exactly that. The sled had tipped. Half the split wood had spilled and lay scattered, already dusted, already becoming part of the ground the way things do out here if no one comes for them fast enough. He followed the rope with his hands because his eyes could not be trusted in that light, in that wind, and the rope led down into a drift-shaped wrong, a shape that had a shoulder in it, a shape that had a small curled hand still closed around fraying nylon. He said her name. He would not, later, remember choosing to know it, only that it left him before he had decided anything, the way his own daughter's name used to leave him across a house, casual, certain of an answer. There was no answer. He cleared snow from her face with the flat of his palm, slow, the way you'd clear frost from a windshield you were afraid of scratching. Her lips had gone past blue into something closer to gray, and her lashes held snow that did not melt, which told him more than a pulse would have, though he checked for that too, 2 fingers at the throat, waiting through a silence that stretched the way silence stretches only when a man has done this kind of waiting before and knows exactly how long is too long. A pulse. Small, unhurried, but there, a thread, not a rope, but holding. Behind him, Tick had gone still in the particular way of a young man watching an older one do something he does not yet have language for. He did not ask if she was alive. He asked, instead, in a voice gone thin, whether the boy would be at the cabin, and Reeve understood the question underneath it, that somewhere a mile off, past this drift, past this rope, there was a fever waiting on someone to come back. He got his arms under her. She weighed nothing and everything, the specific nothing of a body the cold has already begun negotiating with, and the specific everything of every child he had ever failed to reach in time. Her fingers did not open. Even unconscious, even half gone to the white, her hand held the rope, and he found he could not, would not, pry it loose. He simply lifted rope and girl together, one motion, the sled dragging behind them through snow that kept arriving, sideways, indifferent, as he carried her toward the bike, and the 2 miles of storm still standing between them, and whatever waited, warm or not, at the end of that road. He carried her the way he had once imagined carrying another child, 11 years and 340 miles removed from a house that had already stopped being a house by the time he reached it. That night had also had weather in it, though he no longer remembered what kind, only the particular blankness of a man's mind refusing to hold a fact it cannot survive. He remembered the rope of the garden hose someone else had used, uselessly, before he arrived. He remembered how the firemen would not look at him directly, the way men look away from a wound, too large to dress. He had not carried her. That was the whole of it. The sentence his life had been built around since he had not carried her. Now his boots found the snow beneath the drift by feel alone, each step negotiated rather than taken, the girl's weight settling into the crook of his arm, as though she had always belonged there, as though bodies remembered this even when minds did not. Tick walked ahead, breaking trail, glancing back every few strides not at Reeve's face but at his hands, at how they held her, and Reeve understood, without either of them saying it, that the boy was cataloging this for later, for some night down the road, when he would need to know that a man could do this and not break from the doing. The rope dragged between them, the sled skating sideways over crust, catching, freeing itself. He did not let go of it. He could not have said why, except that letting go of the rope felt, in that moment, like a smaller version of every letting go he had already done in his life, and he was done, apparently, without deciding to be done, with practicing that particular skill. 6 days earlier, though he did not know this yet, would not know it until she told him in pieces too small to be called a story, the furnace had died in the kind of cold that turns pipes to iron and turns a father's absence into a math problem no 11-year-old should have to solve. She had done the math anyway. 2 miles to a dead man's woodpile, 2 miles back, a rope, a sled, a brother whose fever would not answer to anything she owned. Reeve did not know the shape of her 6 days. He knew only the weight of her now, and the 2 miles remaining, and the particular silence of a girl who would not release a rope even in the white nowhere of unconsciousness. The wind came at them broadside, indifferent as weather always is, and somewhere ahead, invisible, waiting, real, a cabin held a fevered boy who did not yet know that the woman who had never come home was, for once, about to be replaced by 300 people who would. 6 days earlier, the furnace had made a sound like a held breath finally let go, a metallic sigh, then nothing, and the girl had stood in the kitchen doorway in her socks, waiting for the sound to come back the way it always had before, the small cough and catch that meant the pilot had only stuttered. It did not come back. The cabin's temperature was a thing she had learned to read, the way other children read clocks, the frost patterns on the inside of the window glass, the particular ache that settled into her fingers before her mind admitted it was cold. That first night she had layered every blanket in the house onto her brother's bed and lain beside him in her coat, listening to him breathe in the ragged, effortful way that had started 3 days before and had not, in 6 days, once eased. She had not called anyone. There was no one close enough to call who had not already, in 3 months, proven they would not come. Now, in the white middle of the road, with the wind working at them from the side, the biker carried her the way a man carries something he is afraid to test the weight of twice, and found that fear answered by fact. She weighed almost nothing, a child built mostly of coat and determination, her boots crusted to the ankle in ice that had frozen and thawed and frozen again inside the rubber. He did not try to take the rope from her closed fist. He had learned that much already in the half-mile he'd carried her. Some things a person holds are not rope at all but the last working part of a plan, and a plan, even failed, is not something you take from someone still breathing. Behind him, the younger rider walked the sled himself now, boots punching through crust that gave way to knee-deep powder beneath, hauling the split wood forward foot by foot because the girl no longer could, and the wood, whatever else happened in the next hour, could not be left in a Montana snowbank to be someone else's problem in the spring. He did not ask his older companion where they were going. He had ridden with him 2 winters and had learned that there were subjects the man's face closed around like a fist, and this, a child, a rope, a fever, spoken of only once, and only in the smallest words, had become, in the space of half a mile, one of them. The cabin, when it came into view, came the way most things in Black Ridge came in December. Suddenly, and smaller than expected, a low dark shape leaning slightly on its foundation, with one corner of its roofline sagging under snow it no longer had the strength to hold, smoke absent from a chimney that should have had smoke, and somewhere inside it, waiting on a mattress gone damp with fever sweat, a boy who had stopped, 2 days ago, asking when his sister was coming back. The door had no lock left to speak of, only a length of baling wire twisted through a hole where a latch had once been, and he undid it with fingers that had gone stiff inside his gloves, the wire biting a thin red line across his palm that he would not notice until much later, in warmer light. Inside, the cold was a different animal than the cold outside. The outside cold moved, had wind in it, had purpose. This cold sat. It had settled into the corners and the floorboards and the seams of a mattress pushed close to a dead wood stove, and it had been sitting there long enough that it no longer felt like weather, it felt like absence. The boy did not cry out when the door opened. He turned his head on the pillow, slow, the way a much older person turns toward a sound they are too tired to be afraid of, and looked at the two men filling the doorway with their bulk and their cold, and their smell of exhaust and pine, and said nothing at all. His lips had a color to them that Reeve had seen only twice before in his life, both times on men who did not walk away from where he'd seen it. Tick made a sound low in his throat, not quite a word. Reeve was already moving. He had done this, not this, never exactly this, but its shape, its grammar, in another country a lifetime ago, kneeling over bodies that were not yet bodies, checking what needed checking before anything else could matter. Breath, pulse, the give of the skin. His hand on the boy's forehead came away, having learned a temperature no hand should have to learn from a child, and something in his chest performed a maneuver so old and so practiced that he almost didn't feel it happen, the closing off, the setting aside, the transformation of a feeling into a task. Blankets, he said. Whatever's dry. Tick found two, both thin, both smelling of wood smoke long extinguished, and Reeve wrapped the boy in both without asking whether they were enough, because there was no version of enough available to him in that room, and he had learned, a long time ago, that a man does what is in front of him and does not stop to grieve the size of the gap between that and what is needed. The boy's eyes tracked him without focus, the way a compass needle tracks north through fog, pointed, but not quite arriving. His mouth moved. It took him 3 tries to shape the words into sound. "Is she?" he said, and stopped, and Reeve understood that the boy did not have the strength left to finish a sentence he was afraid of, and so he answered the half of it that had been asked, in the flattest, steadiest voice he owned, the one he had not used since a hospital corridor 11 years gone. "She's coming," he said. "Hold on, she's almost here." 11 years gone, and the corridor had smelled of antiseptic and burnt wiring, and a doctor with tired eyes had said words that arranged themselves into a sentence he had spent over a decade trying to unhear. He had not been in the room when it happened. He had been 340 miles away, on a run that had seemed, at the time, like the kind of thing a man did not miss. He had missed it. That was the whole of it, the entire architecture of the years since. A man built around an absence, load-bearing walls made of the specific fact that he had not been there, and here he was now, in a cabin that smelled of wood smoke and fever sweat, being not absent for a boy who was not his, saying words to a stranger's son that he had never gotten the chance to say to his own. He did not let himself follow that thought further. He had learned, also a long time ago, that grief was a door that opened only one way. You could walk through it, but you could not walk through it and still do the work waiting on the other side. Tick stood near the doorway with the girl's weight still held light and careful against his chest, watching Reeve's hands move over the boy's blankets with a competence that did not look learned so much as remembered, and he understood, without being told, that he was watching something that had happened before, in a different room, to a different child, and had gone wrong. He did not ask. He had ridden with Reeve for 2 years and had never once heard him speak of a daughter, had only pieced together the shape of her from the wooden horse in the saddlebag and the particular silence that fell over the man on certain dates in certain months. He filed it away now with the rest, the way a younger man learns to carry an older man's history without being handed it directly. Outside, the wind had not stopped. It came down off the ridge in long, unbroken sheets, rattling the tin patch over the kitchen roof, filling every seam of the cabin with a cold that no fire built in the last hour could fully answer. Reeve laid his palm flat against the boy's chest, feeling for the rise and fall of it, counting without meaning to, an old habit from another life, another kind of triage. The breathing was shallow but steady. Steady was not the same as safe. He knew the difference better than most men alive. "Tick," he said, not looking up. "Get the radio. Tell them we need a truck up here that can break drift. And tell them now, not when the storm lets up. It's not going to let up." Tick was already moving toward the door, the girl still cradled against him, when the wind found a new gap in the roof and screamed through it like something that had been waiting all along for permission. The sound did not fade so much as travel, moving through the walls like something alive and searching, and for a moment even the fire in the stove seemed to lean away from it. Tick stopped at the threshold with the girl still against his chest, her breathing shallow and quick against the collar of his jacket, and looked back at the man kneeling over the boy, as if the wind had asked a question only he could answer. He did not look up. 11 years ago there had been a different sound, one he had heard second-hand, relayed over a payphone line by a neighbor whose voice kept breaking apart into static and grief in equal measure. The particular groan of a house giving up its frame, the way timber protests before it falls. He had not been there to hear it. He had been 340 miles east, sleeping in a motel bed that smelled of bleach and cigarettes, dreaming of nothing in particular, while his daughter's bedroom filled with smoke, and the smoke became something else. He had built an entire second life out of not thinking about that sound. Tonight the wind was doing its best to remind him that the life had never really replaced anything. It had only covered it, the way snow covers a road without changing what's underneath. "Go," he said again, quieter this time, and Tick went, boots loud on the floorboards, the door shuddering open into a wall of white before slamming shut behind him. The cabin groaned. Somewhere above the kitchen, the tin patch worked loose another half-inch, and a thread of cold air came down through it directly onto the boy's face, and Reeve shifted his body without thinking, angling his shoulder to break the draft, the way he might once have angled himself between a man and a doorway that had no business being open. The boy's eyelids fluttered but did not open. Fever radiated off him in slow, uneven waves, and Reeve pressed the back of his hand to the small forehead and felt heat that had no right to be that constant in a room this cold. He thought about the girl on the sled rope again, the way her fingers had not loosened even in sleep, even carried a mile through drift with her boots gone soft and heavy with ice. He thought about how some children learn to hold on before they learn much else, and how the world rarely thanks them for it. Outside, Tick's voice rose against the wind, sharp with the particular urgency of a man repeating himself into static, and somewhere far down the line, in a clubhouse 2 hours south where the roads were still passable, a phone was ringing that would not stop ringing until someone picked it up. The phone stopped ringing on the 9th try. A voice answered thick with sleep and static, and Tick's words came out faster than the line could carry them. A cabin, a furnace dead 11 days, a boy burning up, a girl who wouldn't have made it another hour. There was a pause on the other end, the kind that comes before a man reaches for his boots instead of his excuses. Then a single word, flat and final, that meant the machinery of the club had already begun turning somewhere out of sight. 11 years ago, there had been no one to call. That was the thought that moved through him uninvited, the way cold moves through a cracked window regardless of what a man wants to feel. 11 years ago, the fire had already taken the roof by the time anyone reached a phone, and the nearest chapter had been 340 miles south, and no engine built could have closed that distance in time. He remembered the exact shade of orange the sky had turned over the ridge as he came up the last mile of gravel, how it had looked almost beautiful before he understood what it meant. He had not let himself remember that color in a long time. It came to him now anyway, unbidden, laid over the gray window, and the boy's fevered face like a transparency held up to the light. He took his hand from the boy's forehead and made himself breathe. The girl's boots sat by the stove where he'd set them, stiff with frozen slush, already beginning to thaw into dark puddles on the floorboards. He watched the water spread in a slow, uneven map and thought of the sled rope again, the fibers gone yellow and frayed from years of use before she had ever touched it, some other hand having worn it soft first. Someone had loaded that sled once, taught her the route through the trees, shown her which fallen limbs to avoid in the dark. He did not know who. He suspected he would learn, and that the answer would cost him something. Outside, Tick's boots crunched back toward the porch, the wind having dropped just enough to let sound travel further than static. The door opened on a gust that smelled of pine smoke and diesel, and the particular metallic sharpness of a front still building somewhere north of the ridge. "They're coming," Tick said, and did not say how many, because he did not yet know, and because the number would not matter until it arrived. Reeve nodded without turning from the bed. The girl stirred once beneath the quilt, murmured something too soft to catch, and settled again, her hand still curled at her side as though the rope were still there, as though letting go were a skill she had never been taught and had no intention of learning now, of all nights, with her brother's breath rattling faint and constant in the dark beside her. 11 years back, a different room had held a different bed, and he made himself stand in it now the way a man makes himself touch a burn to see if it still hurts. The trailer had smelled of crayons and lighter fluid, though he never learned which had caused it, and the report he'd read 3 weeks later in a base housing office used words like point of origin and smoke inhalation. As if grief could be filed under a case number and closed. He had been 340 miles out, running escort for a funeral procession that was, in its way, a rehearsal for the one he would attend himself. Someone had called him at 0200. He remembered the ringing more than the voice. He remembered the highway after, how flat and endless it had seemed, how the headlights had made tunnels that led nowhere he wanted to go. He had not carried anyone since. Not a woman, not a friend's trouble, not even his own reflection some mornings. He had built a life out of routes and patches and the particular silence of engines idling in a lot at 5 a.m., and it had held, mostly, for 11 years, the way a dam holds until it doesn't. Now there was a girl in a bed with a rope-shaped memory curled into her palm, and a boy beside her breathing like a door that wouldn't quite latch, and something in Reeve's chest had come loose that he had spent over a decade welding shut. He sat in the one chair the cabin owned, its cane seat sagging, and watched the boy's chest rise and fall in that small, effortful way that fevered children breathe, a rhythm he remembered from a hospital hallway he'd never actually stood in, because he had arrived after, always after, that was the shape his grief had taken, a man perpetually arriving after. Not this time. Tick came and stood in the doorway without crossing it, the way a younger man does when he senses a room belongs to something older than himself. "Furnace is dead," he said. "Really dead. Cracked heat exchanger. Looks like it's been out 3 weeks, maybe more." He paused. "There's a woodpile a half-mile past the tree line. Somebody's, not theirs. Split good, stacked right. Somebody who knew what they were doing." Reeve said nothing. "You think there's a reason nobody in town came out here?" "I think," Reeve said, "there's a reason nobody in town had to." Tick didn't understand that yet, and Reeve didn't explain it, because explaining it would have meant saying the word neighbor. The way he suspected it needed to be said, with all its rot showing. Instead, he reached into his jacket and found his phone, thumb hovering over a name he had not called in over a year, a man whose voice carried weight across 11 chapters the way a struck bell carries across still water. He pressed the name. Outside, the wind picked back up, and somewhere above the ridge, the front that had been building all day finally leaned its full shoulder into the mountain. The phone rang twice before it picked up. A voice on the other end, rough with sleep or cigarettes or both, said his name like a question and a fact at the same time. Reeve, not "Is this Reeve?" Just his name, set down like a stone on a table. "I need 11 chapters," Reeve said. "I need them fast." There was a pause on the line long enough that he could hear, faintly, a television somewhere in a kitchen, 400 miles east, a life going on in a room he would never see. Then the voice said, "Tell me." He told him. He did it the way he had learned to report things in another life, in another country, stripping the words down to what mattered and nothing else. Location, condition, need. A cabin off Route 9 outside Black Ridge. A furnace with a cracked heat exchanger, dead, going on 3 weeks. A boy with a fever 6 days running. A girl who pulled wood 2 miles by rope, because there was no one else to do it. He did not say, "Neighbor." He did not say, "The county never came." He let the facts stand there in the cold like the woodpile itself, split and stacked by a stranger's hands, and let the man on the other end draw the conclusion he could not bring himself to draw aloud. Furnace, the voice repeated. Roof? Roof's going. Kitchen corner's already sagging. Wood? They'll need 9 cords to make it through. Another silence. Shorter this time, the kind a man takes when he is already moving before he has finished thinking. 18 hours, the voice said. You'll have riders from here to the Canadian line before this thing you're standing in even knows it's a storm. Then, quieter, almost an afterthought, though Reeve knew there were no afterthoughts with this man. You good? I'm good, Reeve said, and did not know if it was true. He ended the call and stood there with the phone still warm against his palm, watching Tick watch him from the doorway, the boy's breath fogging in the unheated air of a house that had, until an hour ago, belonged only to 2 children and a fever that would not quit. Outside, the wind found the loose flashing on the roof and worked it like a tongue against a bad tooth, a small metallic complaint against a sky that had already decided what it was going to do. 11 chapters, Tick said, not quite believing it. 300 riders, give or take, Reeve said, by tomorrow afternoon. Tick looked at him the way a man looks at something he has heard about but never seen, a flood, a fire, a debt finally called in, and said nothing more, because there was nothing left to ask that the coming hours wouldn't answer themselves. 11 years earlier, the phone had rung the same way, a small mechanical insistence in a quiet room, and he had answered it standing in a gravel lot 340 miles from a house that was already burning. He remembered the exact temperature of that phone against his ear, remembered thinking, in the half-second before the words arrived, that whatever this was could wait until morning. It could not wait until morning. Nothing that mattered ever seemed to ask permission first. He carried that lot with him now, the way a man carries a stone in a boot he has stopped noticing. He set it down beside the girl's bed without meaning to, looking at the fever flush along her brother's small jaw, at the way she had positioned herself at the foot of the mattress, like a dog that had decided, long ago, this was the only post worth guarding. The furnace in the corner sat cold and useless, a dead animal nobody had buried. He crouched and ran his thumb along a seam of rust near its base, more from habit than diagnosis. He already knew, had known within 30 seconds of walking in, that this thing was not coming back to life no matter what a man with his hands could do to it. Some machines died the way people did, quietly, and long before anyone noticed. They're not sending anyone, the girl said, from the doorway, not a question. They're sending 300, he said. She studied him the way she'd studied the storm that morning, assessing whether it was the kind that passed or the kind that stayed. Why? He didn't answer right away. Outside, the flashing kept working itself loose against the wind, a metronome counting down to something none of them could yet name. He thought of a wooden horse riding in a saddlebag through 300 miles of Montana dark, of a girl's hand still curled, hours later, in the shape of a rope she was no longer holding. Because nobody came the first time, he said finally, for a lot of people, including me. She held his gaze a beat longer than a child should be able to, then went back to her post at the foot of the bed, laying her palm flat against her brother's forehead, the way she must have done 100 mornings running, checking for a break in the fever that had not yet arrived. Tick stood in the hall, saying nothing, watching the two of them the way he'd watch weather, waiting to see which way it would turn before he trusted it enough to speak. The night moved the way night moves in a house with a sick child in it, not in hours but in intervals, measured by breath, by the small rattle that came up from the boy's chest and then eased, by the time she rose to check the wood stove and add another split log to a fire that could not, by itself, undo what 6 days of failed furnace had done to the walls. Reeve sat in a chair he'd carried from the kitchen, elbows on his knees, and did not sleep. He had done this before. 11 years before, in a different room, he had not been given the choice. He found himself listening for the boy's cough, the way he had once listened for radio static, on a road 340 miles from a house that was, at that exact hour, already burning. There was no sense in the comparison, and he made it anyway. That was the shape grief took after enough years. Not a wound anymore, just a habit of measuring every small emergency against the one he had lost. Near 4 in the morning, the girl's chin dropped to her chest where she sat, and she caught herself before sleep could take her, the way someone catches themselves at the edge of a step they didn't know was there. He watched her fight it twice more before he spoke, quiet, so as not to wake the boy. "I'll watch him." She looked at him with the same weighing look she'd given the number 300, turning it over for the flaw in it. "You'll wake me." "If anything changes," he said. "Yes." She studied his hands a moment, the scars across the knuckles, the calluses, the steadiness in them, and something in that inventory seemed to satisfy some private accounting she was keeping. She did not thank him. She simply lay down on the floor beside the bed, on a folded quilt that had clearly served this purpose before, and was asleep within a minute, the way only the truly exhausted sleep, without transition, like a light switched off. Tick came and stood in the doorway again, arms crossed, watching the boy's shallow breathing rise and fall under the lantern light. "You didn't tell her," he said, low, "why you're really doing this." Reeve did not look away from the bed. "She already knows more about why people do things than most grown men I've ridden with." Outside, the wind had not let up, and somewhere down the long, white miles of highway between Black Ridge and the rest of Montana, engines that did not yet know exactly where they were going had already begun, one chapter at a time, to turn over in the cold. The lantern burned low through the middle hours, its flame drawn thin by the draft that found its way under the door, no matter how many rags had been packed against the sill. He sat in the chair he had pulled from the kitchen, elbows on his knees, watching the boy's chest rise in its shallow, effortful way, and he did not sleep, though he had told himself he would take an hour if the fever held steady. It did not entirely hold. Twice the boy's breath caught and stuttered, and twice Reeve laid 2 fingers against the small wrist and counted, the way he had been taught to count a pulse under fire 11 years before he had ever imagined counting one under a roof that leaked snow. Both times the rhythm steadied on its own before he had to decide what steadying it himself would mean. 11 years ago, there had been no one to count. He had been 340 miles away, on a straight black highway outside Billings, when the call came through, and by the time the sound of it had finished traveling through him, there had been nothing left to count at all. He had not sat beside a bed like this since. He had not let himself be needed in a room where someone might not make it, because the last room like that had made a liar out of every promise he'd ever made about being there. He looked at the girl asleep on the floor, one hand still loosely curled as if the rope were still in it, and thought that she had learned to sleep like a soldier, lightly, on the ground, ready to be woken by anything that mattered and nothing that didn't. Near 4 in the morning, the wind found a new pitch, higher and thinner, and rattled the stovepipe until Tick got up without being asked and went out into it to check the truck, the tire chains, the tarp over the split wood they'd hauled in. He came back dusted white to the eyebrows, breath smoking, and said nothing, only nodded once to confirm the obvious, that it was worse now, not better, and that whatever was coming down out of the north had not yet arrived at the worst of itself. Reeve took the little carved horse from his jacket pocket without meaning to, turned it once between 2 fingers, and set it on the small table by the bed, close enough that if the boy woke frightened in the dark, he would find something gentle there before he found anything else. Then he took out his phone, walked to the doorway where one bar of signal sometimes lived, and began, for the second time that night, to make the calls that would decide how many engines turned north before daylight. The first call went to the same man he'd woken hours before, and this time there was no need to explain twice. Numbers were already moving through the dark in a shape he could not see but had learned, over 20 years of patches and phone trees, to trust the way he trusted weather, invisible, gathering, certain. He gave the mile markers again, slower this time, because a plow had come through since, and buried the turnoff sign under a drift shaped like a shoulder. He said the word furnace. He said the word roof. He did not say the word girl, because he did not trust his voice to hold the shape of it out loud a second time, and the man on the other end did not ask him to. He stood in the doorway long after the call ended, watching his own breath go out pale and disappear, listening to the wind worry at the eaves, the way it had worried at another roof, 11 winters gone, in a house he had not reached in time. He let himself feel the comparison the way he let himself touch a scar, briefly, without flinching, enough to confirm it was still there and had healed as much as it was going to. Behind him, the boy shifted under the quilt and murmured something that was not quite a word, and the girl, without opening her eyes, reached over in her sleep and settled a hand against his shoulder the way she must have done every night of the 6 that had passed since the furnace died, a small unconscious act of guarding that had nothing left in it of fear, only habit. Reeve watched that hand a long moment. Then he went back to the phone. By the time the sky along the ridge began its first gray thinning, less an arrival of light than a slow subtraction of dark, he had spoken to riders in 4 states, had heard the word convoy used without irony, had heard a woman's voice on a walkie relay say 11 chapters like a tally she was proud of. Tick sat by the stove feeding it split wood with the careful economy of a man rationing something he was no longer sure would last, and did not ask what number they'd reached, because the answer was already written on Reeve's face. Not triumph, nothing so simple as that, but the particular stillness of a man who has finally found a fire he can reach in time. He put the phone away. Outside, the wind had not softened, but somewhere south of them, engines were being pulled from heated garages into the cold, and chains were going onto tires by headlamp, and the whole slow machinery of men keeping a promise had already begun to turn. By 7, the light had come up the color of dishwater, flat and without warmth, the kind of gray that made the snow look less like snow than ash settled over everything for miles. He stood at the window with the wooden horse in his palm again, though he did not remember taking it from the saddlebag, and he turned it the way a man turns a coin he no longer expects to spend, only to feel it exists. 11 years ago there had been a different gray morning, 400 miles east of here, and a phone ringing in a motel room that smelled of diesel and burnt coffee. He had let it ring twice before answering, because he had been tired, because the run had been long, because there had been no reason yet to believe that 2 rings would matter more than anything else in his life. He did not let himself finish that memory now. He set the horse on the sill instead, facing the window, as if it might watch the road with him. Mara slept on the cot with the boy's foot against her ribs, and her hand had gone slack in sleep for the first time since he'd carried her in, the fingers finally uncurled from whatever they had been holding all these mornings. He noticed this the way he noticed weather, a change in pressure, not yet named, but felt. The first engines reached them a little after 9, a sound that came up through the floorboards before it arrived at the ears, a deep, continuous rumor moving through the ground itself. Tick went to the door first, and stood there without opening it, listening the way a man listens to weather he has been told is coming, but has not yet learned to trust. Then he opened it, and the cold poured in flat and hard, and beyond it, strung out along the buried logging road, like beads on a wire, came the lights. Dozens of them, then more. Headlamps cutting pale cones through the blowing snow, engines idling in low gear against the grade, exhaust rising white and folding back into the whiter air. Reeve did not go to the door right away. He watched Mara instead, watched her wake to the sound the way a person wakes to a sound they have been waiting 11 years, or 30 years, or their whole life to hear without knowing it. Her eyes opened, she looked at the window, then at him, and she did not smile, not yet, only listened, the way she had learned to listen to everything that came out of the dark, before deciding whether it meant to hurt her. Outside, the first riders were already dismounting, stamping snow from their boots, calling numbers to each other across the wind, cords, feet, hours, the practical language of men who had come to work and intended to finish before dark found them again. By full light there were more than anyone had bothered to count, though someone would later say 300, and no one who was there that day argued the number down. They came off the trucks and trailers in canvas coats and leather worn soft as saddle skin, carrying tools that had nothing to do with wrenches or chains, pry bars, coils of copper line, a propane furnace still crated, sheets of roofing tin lashed under tarps that cracked like sails in the wind. A man with a gray beard and no club patch, only a faded cross tattooed where his throat met his collar, knelt by the boy's bed and took his temperature with a steady hand before anyone asked him to. Another climbed onto the roof where the kitchen had caved soft under the last snow, testing the rafters with his boot heel the way a man tests ice, calling down measurements to a woman below him who wrote them on her forearm in marker because she'd left her notebook on the bike. The girl stood in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket someone had put around her without asking, watching the yard fill with strangers who moved like they had done this before, in other winters, in other towns, for people whose names they had not yet learned. She did not speak. She only watched the way the wood came off the trucks in cords already split, stacked along the porch rail faster than she had ever imagined wood could move, and something in her face, Reeve saw it from across the yard, was not relief yet. It was disbelief holding its breath, waiting to see if the thing in front of her would still be there when she exhaled. Tick came and stood beside him, breath fogging, hands shoved in his jacket. Neither of them spoke for a while. Below, the furnace crate was being pried open, nails shrieking free of the wood one by one, and the sound of it carried oddly clear across the snow, like something being let out. "She hasn't cried," Tick said finally. Reeve watched the girl's hand, still curled at her side, as though it remembered the rope even now, that the rope lay coiled and forgotten by the sled, half buried, its purpose already becoming a story rather than a task. "She will," he said, "not for this." He did not say what he meant, and Tick did not ask. Above them, a man on the roof called down that the rot went further than they'd thought, and another voice answered that it didn't matter. They had time, they had daylight, they had enough hands to spend both freely. They had enough hands to spend both freely, and by the time the light went the color of weak tea over the ridgeline, the roof was closed, the furnace was breathing its low mechanical hum through a house that had forgotten the sound, and the cordwood stood stacked in a wall along the north side of the cabin, 9 cords, more wood than the family had seen in the whole of the boy's short life. He did not wake to see most of it. He woke instead to warmth, which is a different thing than waking to noise, and he did not understand for 3 days why his skin no longer ached from the inside. A year is not a long time for a mountain. It is a long time for a child's hands. By the following December, the girl no longer rose before dawn. There was no rope to coil, no sled with a runner worn thin as a blade, no 2 miles of dark road measured out in breath and fear. The brotherhood came once a month, unannounced but expected, trucks idling in the yard, while men who had once been strangers checked the furnace's pilot light and the boy's color, and left before they could be thanked properly, because being thanked properly was not the point. She gave him the second horse in July, whittled from a scrap of kindling with a jackknife someone had shown her how to hold, its legs slightly uneven, its head tilted as though listening for something far off. He kept it beside the first, both of them lashed with wire to the left handlebar of the bike he had ridden 340 miles too late, 11 years before, and near enough on time this time. 2 horses now, one carved by a hand he had lost, one carved by a hand he had kept from being lost. He did not explain this to anyone. No one asked him to. In October, on a morning without wind, he drove 400 miles south to a cemetery he had avoided since the funeral, and he knelt in grass gone brittle with frost, and set a third horse against the granite, small and imperfect, its legs slightly uneven, its head tilted as though listening. He said nothing. There was nothing that needed saying that the object did not already say, that he had carried her weight all this time and had finally set some part of it down, not because the grief had lifted, but because it had, at last, been given somewhere to go. Above him the sky was the flat, indifferent gray of every winter he had survived. He stayed a long while. Then he rode north, toward the mountain, toward the cabin with its new roof and its patient furnace, toward the brotherhood that had remembered 2 children the town had forgotten and did not